Mother Bear broke into bakery to feed. Human newborn. Security footage left owners weeping. Let us know where you are watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The night was unusually cold for early spring, with silvery moonlight streaming through the windows of Sweetleaf Bakery. The small shop sat nestled at the edge of Pine Ridge Forest, where the wilderness met the sleepy town of Maplewood. Inside, the rich aroma of sourdough and cinnamon lingered hours after closing time. Sarah and Thomas Holloway moved quietly in the back room, organizing supplies for tomorrow's baking, while their 6-week-old daughter Emma slept peacefully in her portable crib behind the front counter. "Just a few more minutes," Sarah whispered to Thomas as she counted bags of flour. She glanced at the baby monitor clipped to her apron, the soft rise and fall of Emma's chest visible on the tiny screen. The couple had taken to bringing their newborn to the bakery during evening inventory, a necessity for the new parents who couldn't afford additional childcare for their fledgling business. Outside, the forest stirred with night sounds. A mother black bear, her coat rough and her frame gaunt from the harsh winter, padded silently along the edge of the trees with her small cub following closely. The larger bear paused, lifting her nose to the air. The sweet scent of bread and pastries pulled at her empty stomach. Food had been scarce since emerging from hibernation, and her milk was running dry for her hungry cub. The bear's instincts would normally keep her far from human establishments, but tonight was different. Hunger drove her forward, step by tentative step, toward the warm glow of the bakery's back door, the one Thomas had failed to latch properly after taking out the evening trash. With one gentle nudge of her powerful snout, the door swung open. The mother bear hesitated at the threshold, dark eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. Her cub squeaked softly behind her, pushing against her hind legs. Hunger overcame caution, and the bear stepped inside. The warmth enveloped her immediately, along with the overwhelming scent of food. She moved carefully through the storage area, past sacks of ingredients and cooling racks. Her large paws made surprisingly little noise on the tile floor as she followed her nose toward the front of the shop. And then she heard it. A soft, unfamiliar sound. A tiny whimper that wasn't from her cub. The mother bear froze, every sense alert. In the front of the bakery, baby Emma stirred in her crib, making those little pre-cry noises that new parents learn to recognize. The bear moved forward cautiously until she could see the source of the sound. There, in a strange nest of soft blankets, lay a human infant, smaller and more fragile-looking than anything the bear had encountered in the wild. The mother bear tilted her head, studying the tiny creature. Emma's eyes opened, dark blue and unfocused, staring up at the massive animal that now stood beside her crib. She didn't cry. Instead, she cooed, tiny fingers reaching up toward the strange visitor. The bear's cub, curious about this new discovery, squeezed past its mother's legs and approached the crib, standing on hind legs to peer at the human baby. Their eyes met, wild animal and human child, in a moment of innocent wonder. What would happen next would leave anyone questioning everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between wild animals and humans. What maternal instinct would drive this hungry bear's actions? And how would the security camera in the corner, silently recording every moment of this extraordinary encounter, later reduce the bakery owners to tears? The night had only just begun to unfold its impossible story. In the storage room, Sarah paused while counting inventory. "Did you hear something?" she asked Thomas, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas shook his head, focused on restocking the baking supplies. Probably just the wind. The forecast said a storm might roll in tonight. Sarah wasn't convinced. She had developed that sixth sense that new mothers often speak of, an almost supernatural ability to detect anything unusual that might affect their child. She glanced again at the baby monitor, but the camera angle showed only part of the crib. Emma appeared to be moving slightly, but nothing seemed amiss. "I'll just check on her quickly," Sarah said, setting down her clipboard. Thomas nodded absently. "I'm almost done here. Then we can head home." Meanwhile, in the front of the bakery, the mother bear was moving with surprising gentleness for such a large creature. Her cub had grown bolder, pressing his small paws against the side of the crib. Emma's tiny hand reached out through the slats, and for one breathtaking moment her delicate fingers brushed against the cub's fur. The mother bear watched this interaction, her dark eyes reflecting intelligence far beyond what most humans would credit to a wild animal. She turned her attention to the counter, where fresh bread and pastries were stored under clear display cases. With one powerful swipe, she could easily shatter the glass and take all the food inside. Her hungry cub looked expectantly at her, then back at the human infant who was now gurgling happily. Instead of breaking into the display, the bear did something extraordinary. She reached for a small basket of bread rolls that had been left out for the next morning's sandwich preparation. Taking one soft roll in her mouth with surprising delicacy, she moved back to the crib and very carefully dropped it inside, near Emma's feet. The bear's cub watched, confused by its mother's actions. Hunger gnawed at them both. Yet, instead of taking the food for themselves, the mother bear seemed to be offering it to this strange, hairless creature. The cub mimicked its mother, picking up a small chunk of bread that had fallen to the floor and placing it tentatively in the crib as well. Emma kicked her legs excitedly at this new game, completely unafraid of the massive predators leaning over her crib. Her innocent joy seemed to spark something primal and protective in the mother bear, who began to make a soft huffing sound, the same comforting noise she used to soothe her own cub. Outside the bakery, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The storm was rolling in faster than forecasted, and with it came an unexpected visitor. A local stray dog, a large, aggressive mutt that often scavenged through the town's garbage, had caught the scent of bread and bears. The dog approached the bakery's back door, which still stood slightly ajar, his hackles rising at the unfamiliar bear scent. Inside, the mother bear's ears perked up instantly. She sensed the new threat before any human could have detected it. Her maternal instinct, already engaged with both her cub and now somehow extended to the human infant, shifted into high alert. The bear positioned herself between the crib and the doorway leading to the back of the bakery, her posture changing from gentle curiosity to fierce protection. Her cub, sensing the danger, retreated to the side of the crib, pressing against it as if seeking shelter near the human baby. Emma, oblivious to the growing tension, continued to coo and reach toward the cub. The dog appeared in the doorway between the storage area and the front of the bakery, teeth bared and a low growl rumbling from its throat. It had been hoping for an easy meal, but now faced an angry mother bear. The standoff was immediate and intense. Wild animal versus domestic gone feral, both hungry, both potentially dangerous. The mother bear rose to her full height, towering over the crib in a protective stance that any mother of any species would recognize. Her message was clear. To reach either baby, bear, or human, the dog would have to go through her first. Sarah, having heard the dog's growl, froze halfway through the storage room. Her blood turned to ice as she took in the impossible scene through the partially open door to the front of the bakery. A massive black bear stood beside her daughter's crib, reared up on hind legs. A snarling dog faced off against the bear, and somewhere in the mix was a small bear cub. And in the middle of this wild tableau was Emma, her precious baby, seemingly surrounded by danger from all sides. Sarah's scream caught in her throat. Her instinct was to rush forward, to reach her child at any cost, but fear paralyzed her. Thomas, alerted by his wife's sudden stillness, moved quickly to her side. He, too, saw the unbelievable scene, and his hand shot out to grab Sarah's arm, holding her back from what seemed like certain danger. "Oh, my God," he whispered, his face drained of color. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." The security camera in the corner captured it all: the bear's protective stance over the crib, the threatening dog, the terrified parents, and most incredibly the peaceful baby who remained untouched and unafraid in the midst of the chaos. What happened next would defy every expectation and challenge everything the young parents thought they knew about wild animals, danger, protection, and the mysterious connections that can form between the most unlikely creatures. The stray dog lunged forward with a ferocious bark, spittle flying from its jaws. In that split second, Thomas reached for his phone to call for help, but there was no time. The mother bear moved with astonishing speed, intercepting the dog before it could get anywhere near the crib. She didn't attack with her full strength. She merely swatted the dog aside with one powerful paw, sending it tumbling into a display of sourdough loaves. The dog yelped in surprise but quickly regained its footing, snarling even more fiercely now. It circled widely, searching for an opening to attack or to reach what it perceived as unguarded food. The mother bear tracked its every movement, her massive body shifting to always remain between the threat and the two young ones, her cub and, inexplicably, the human infant. Emma began to fuss now, the tension in the room finally breaking through her innocent calm. Her first whimpers quickly escalated toward full-blown crying. The sound seemed to affect the mother bear profoundly. She turned briefly toward the crib, making that same soft huffing noise from before. What happened then left Sarah and Thomas frozen in disbelief. The bear's cub, responding perhaps to some unspoken instruction from its mother, climbed carefully into the crib. It curled up next to Emma, their faces just inches apart, and began to make a gentle purring sound. Emma's cries subsided almost immediately, her tiny hands reaching out to touch the cub's fur. "This can't be happening," Sarah whispered, clutching Thomas's arm so tightly that her nails left half-moon imprints in his skin. The dog, seeing the bear momentarily distracted, made another lunge. This time, the mother bear caught it squarely, pinning it briefly to the floor with one paw before releasing it with a warning growl that seemed to shake the very walls of the bakery. The message was unmistakable: leave now or face worse consequences. The dog, finally recognizing it was outmatched, tucked its tail and slunk backward toward the storage room, still growling but no longer attacking. It disappeared through the back door into the gathering storm outside. Only then did the bear turn her attention to Sarah and Thomas, seeing them clearly for the first time. The young parents stood paralyzed, barely breathing, certain they were about to face the full fury of a wild animal whose cub was now entangled with their child. Instead, the mother bear lowered herself from her aggressive posture, dropping to all fours in a gesture that seemed almost respectful. She looked from the humans to the crib where her cub and their baby lay together, then back at the parents. Her eyes held an intelligence that transcended species, a mutual recognition of the maternal bond they shared. Slowly, deliberately, the bear moved a few steps away from the crib, creating a path for the parents to reach their child. It was an invitation, a peace offering of sorts, though one that required tremendous trust to accept. Sarah was the first to move, maternal courage overcoming her fear. She took one hesitant step forward, then another. The bear remained perfectly still, watching but not threatening. Thomas followed close behind his wife, his hand on her shoulder, ready to pull her back at the first sign of danger. When they reached the crib, Sarah leaned in carefully, mindful of the bear cub that still lay curled against Emma. Her daughter looked up at her with wide, peaceful eyes, one hand still resting on the cub's soft fur. "She's completely fine," Sarah breathed in amazement. "She's not scared at all." Thunder crashed outside, and the lights in the bakery flickered momentarily. The mother bear glanced toward the windows, then back at her cub, making a soft grunting sound. The cub seemed reluctant to leave its new friend, but eventually climbed out of the crib with surprising care. Sarah immediately lifted Emma into her arms, checking her for any sign of injury or distress. There was none, only a strange contentment and the lingering warmth where the bear cub had nestled against her. Thomas backed away slowly, pulling Sarah and Emma with him toward the relative safety of the storage room. They expected the mother bear to take advantage of their retreat to raid the bakery's food supplies. It would have been a small price to pay for their daughter's safety. Instead, the bear did something that would later reduce them to tears when they watched the security footage. She gathered only a single loaf of bread in her mouth, nudged her cub toward the door, and paused to look back once more at the human family. Then, with dignity that belied her wild nature, she led her cub out through the bakery and disappeared into the storm-tossed night. The entire encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it would forever change the way Sarah and Thomas understood the natural world and the creatures they shared it with. After securing all doors and windows with trembling hands, Thomas called the local wildlife authority to report the incident. Even as he spoke, he found himself downplaying the bear's presence, saying only that a bear had briefly entered the bakery but left without incident. He made no mention of the extraordinary interaction with their daughter. Some things were too sacred, too impossible to explain. Later that night, when they had returned safely to their small home above the bakery, Sarah reviewed the security footage. Thomas sat beside her, Emma sleeping peacefully in his arms. What they saw on the grainy black and white video left them both in tears. The camera had captured everything: the mother bear's initial curiosity upon finding Emma, the offering of food to the human infant, the protective stance against the threatening dog, and the gentle interactions between the bear cub and their daughter. But it also showed something they had missed in their fear and confusion: moments when the mother bear had actually adjusted Emma's blanket with her snout, tucking it more securely around the infant when she had kicked it loose. "It's like she was—" Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. Her voice choked with emotion. "Taking care of her," Thomas completed the thought. "Just like you would." They watched the footage again and again, each viewing revealing new details of tenderness from this wild creature toward their child. The bear had not only refrained from harm, she had actively protected and nurtured a human baby, treating Emma as if she were her own cub. But the most extraordinary revelation came near the end of the footage, just before the bear had left the bakery. The camera had captured something neither Sarah nor Thomas had noticed in the moment. The mother bear had left something beside the crib, a small, shiny object that caught the light as she turned to go. "Pause it there," Thomas said, leaning forward. "What is that?" Sarah rewound and paused the footage, zooming in as much as the low-resolution video would allow. There, clearly visible beside the crib, was a small golden locket. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. "How would a wild bear have a golden locket?" They rushed back downstairs to the bakery, searching the area around the crib. The locket was still there, partially hidden beneath the edge of a fallen napkin. Thomas picked it up carefully, turning it over in his palm. It was tarnished but unmistakably gold, with intricate engravings on its surface. With trembling fingers, he managed to open it. Inside was a tiny faded photograph of a young woman holding a baby, and beside it, a small lock of dark hair tied with thread. "This doesn't make any sense," Sarah said, taking the locket from Thomas to examine it more closely. "This has to be decades old." As they stared at the mysterious object, a wild theory began to form in their minds, one too fantastical to speak aloud yet impossible to dismiss. Could this mother bear have once been something else? Someone else? Or was there some other explanation for her unnaturally human behavior and the antique locket she had carried? Outside, the storm raged on, wind and rain lashing against the windows of Sweet Leaf Bakery. Somewhere in the darkness of Pine Ridge Forest, a mother bear and her cub huddled in the shelter of a hollow tree, the taste of freely given bread still fresh in their mouths, and the memory of a human connection that defied natural law imprinted on their wild hearts. Morning came with clearing skies and the soft glow of sunlight filtering through dissipating clouds. Sarah and Thomas had barely slept, taking turns holding Emma and discussing in hushed tones the events of the previous night. The golden locket lay on their kitchen table, an impossible artifact from an impossible encounter. "We should take this to someone," Thomas said, touching the locket gently. "A historian, maybe, or the local museum. There might be records of who this belonged to." Sarah nodded slowly, though she felt strangely protective of the locket and its secret. "What about reporting the bear? I know you called Wildlife Services last night, but you didn't tell them everything." Thomas ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "If we tell them what really happened, they'll think we're crazy. Or worse, they might decide the bear is too comfortable around humans and needs to be—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Relocated," Sarah supplied softly, though they both knew that wasn't always the outcome for bears that interacted with humans. "But she saved Emma. She protected our baby from that stray dog. How can we not try to protect her in return?" Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the bakery's front door. Thomas glanced at his watch. It was barely 6:30 a.m., well before their usual opening time. Through the glass he could see an elderly woman bundled in a worn coat, her silver hair tucked beneath a hand-knit cap. "It's Eleanor Blackwood," he said with surprise. Eleanor was the oldest resident of Maplewood, a reclusive woman who lived alone at the edge of the forest, rarely coming into town except for absolute necessities. Sarah quickly tucked the locket into her pocket and went to open the door. "Mrs. Blackwood, is everything all right?" The old woman's eyes, sharp and clear despite her advanced age, fixed immediately on Emma in Sarah's arms. "The child is unharmed?" she asked without preamble. Thomas and Sarah exchanged startled glances. "Yes, she's fine," Sarah replied cautiously. "How did you—" "I saw the bear and her cub returning to the forest last night," Eleanor said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Near my cabin, she had bread in her mouth." The old woman's gaze was intense, almost unsettling. Something happened here. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Thomas felt a chill run up his spine. "Mrs. Blackwood, would you like to sit down? Can we offer you some coffee or fresh bread?" The old woman nodded, settling herself at one of the small tables near the window. As Thomas busied himself preparing coffee, Sarah sat across from Eleanor, still cradling Emma protectively. "You're not surprised," Sarah observed quietly, "about the bear coming into the bakery." Eleanor's weathered hands folded neatly on the table. "No, child, I am not surprised. That particular bear has a history with humans in this valley." Sarah leaned forward. "What do you mean? Has she done this before?" The elderly woman accepted the cup of coffee Thomas placed before her, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. Not exactly this, no, but she has always been different. She took a small sip, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Some creatures carry old souls, very old souls. Thomas sat down beside his wife, skepticism battling with the memory of what he had witnessed the night before. Mrs. Blackwood, what exactly are you suggesting? Instead of answering directly, Eleanor asked, "Did she leave anything behind?" Sarah's hand instinctively went to her pocket where the locket was hidden. The old woman smiled, a knowing expression that deepened the wrinkles around her eyes. "May I see it?" she asked gently. With hesitation, Sarah withdrew the golden locket and placed it on the table between them. Eleanor didn't touch it immediately, simply studying it with a gaze that seemed to reach back through decades. "I haven't seen this in 60 years, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas and Sarah exchanged shocked glances. "This belongs to you?" Thomas asked. Eleanor shook her head slowly. Number "it" belonged to Lily Harmon, my sister. With trembling fingers, she finally picked up the locket, opening it to reveal the faded photograph inside. This was taken in 1958. That's Lily and her daughter Rebecca. Sarah's mind raced to make sense of this revelation. But how did a bear come to have your sister's locket? And why would she bring it here to us? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. Lily and her baby disappeared in the winter of 1959. There was a terrible blizzard. They were traveling from Maplewood to the next town over, where Lily's husband was working at the lumber camp. They never arrived. Thomas felt his skin prickle with gooseflesh. "Are you saying they died in the forest, where the bears live now?" "Search parties looked for weeks," Eleanor continued, her voice distant with memory. "They found their wagon, overturned in a ravine, but never their bodies. It was as if the forest had simply taken them." Sarah looked down at Emma, peacefully sleeping in her arms, unaware of the strange story unfolding around her. But the locket, how would it survive all these years in the wilderness? And why would a bear have it? The old woman closed the locket gently, holding it in her palm as if weighing its significance. There are old stories in these mountains. Stories of spirits that take animal form to survive when their human bodies fail them. Stories of mothers whose love is too powerful to be extinguished, even by death. Thomas let out a nervous laugh. "Mrs. Blackwood, with all due respect, you're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "I'm simply telling you what I know, that my sister and her child were lost in these woods, that the black bears of this forest have always been unusually intelligent, especially the females, and that since Lily's disappearance there have been stories, just rumors, mind you, of a mother bear who watches over lost children." She placed the locket back on the table, sliding it toward Sarah. "Over the decades, a few children who wandered too far into the woods have been found safely asleep in hollow logs or sheltered caves, with no memory of how they got there except for dreams of being guided by a gentle bear." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes, though she couldn't explain why. "And you think this bear—" "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that love is the most powerful force in this world, and sometimes it finds ways to continue its work long after we would think it possible." Thomas, the more practical of the couple, struggled to process this conversation. Even if we accept this folklore, why would the bear bring the locket to us? To Emma? Eleanor smiled sadly. "Perhaps because the locket has served its purpose. Perhaps because your daughter is safe now, protected by parents who would do anything for her, just as my sister would have done anything for Rebecca." She paused, looking out the window toward the forest. Or, perhaps, because after all these years, she's finally ready to let go. A heavy silence fell over the bakery, broken only by the soft sounds of Emma's breathing and the distant calls of birds greeting the morning. The golden locket gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the window, its secret impossible to prove or disprove. Finally, Eleanor rose to her feet. "I should return home. I've said what I came to say." Sarah stood as well, shifting Emma to one arm so she could pick up the locket. "Mrs. Blackwood, this belongs to your family. You should have it." The old woman shook her head firmly. "No, child. It came to you for a reason. Keep it safe for your daughter. Perhaps someday she'll understand its meaning better than any of us can." As Eleanor moved toward the door, she paused, her hand on the frame. "One more thing. The bear and her cub, they're hungry. This spring has been hard on all the forest creatures." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken request. "We'll leave some bread at the forest edge, away from the hiking trails, where only they might find it." "A kindness," Eleanor said with approval. "Just don't make a habit of it. Wild things should stay wild, even those with old souls." With those words, she stepped out into the morning light and began her slow walk back toward the edge of town. Sarah and Thomas stood in the doorway, watching her go, the locket clutched tightly in Sarah's hand, and their daughter sleeping peacefully, unaware of the strange legacy she had somehow become part of. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in watercolor hues of purple and orange, Thomas placed a basket of fresh bread at the edge of the forest behind the bakery. They didn't speak about it. Not about the bread or the bear or Eleanor's fantastical story of spirits and enduring love. Some things defied rational explanation, and sometimes it was better not to try. They simply went about their lives, opening the bakery each morning, caring for their daughter, and occasionally leaving bread at the forest's edge. They never saw the mother bear or her cub again, at least not up close. Sometimes in the twilight hours they caught glimpses of shapes moving among the trees at the far border of their property, a larger shadow followed by a smaller one. But the bears never again approached the bakery. The security footage from that night became their most cherished secret. They watched it sometimes in the quiet hours after Emma had gone to sleep, marveling at the gentle way the wild bear had treated their child, the protective stance against danger, the offering of food instead of taking it. Whether the bear was truly the spirit of a long-lost mother or simply an animal with extraordinary instincts, they could never be certain. The golden locket they kept in a small wooden box on their mantel, planning to give it to Emma when she was old enough to understand the story, or perhaps their version of it, softened and simplified for a child's ears. How much of Eleanor's mystical explanation they would include, they hadn't decided. 1 month after the night of the storm, a package arrived at Sweetleaf Bakery, addressed simply to the family at the forest edge. Inside was a bundle of yellowed newspaper clippings about the disappearance of Lily Harmon and her infant daughter in the winter of 1959, along with a faded journal wrapped in protective cloth. A note in Eleanor Blackwood's spidery handwriting explained, "These were Lily's writings from the months before she disappeared. I've kept them all these years, waiting for the right time to share them. That time is now." That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah and Thomas sat by the fireplace and carefully turned the fragile pages of Lily's journal. Most entries were mundane descriptions of daily life as a young mother in a small town, until they reached the final pages, dated just days before Lily's disappearance. December 14th, 1959, Sarah read aloud, her voice hushed in the quiet room. "Rebecca and I leave tomorrow to join James at the lumber camp. The weather looks threatening. But we cannot wait any longer. Our money is nearly gone, and James hasn't been able to send any home this month. I'm afraid to make the journey alone with Rebecca, especially in winter, but I'm more afraid of staying here with nothing to feed her. Eleanor offered to let us stay, but her own situation is hardly better than mine. I must be brave for my daughter." Thomas leaned closer, peering at the next entry. This is dated December 15th, the day they left. Sarah continued reading. "We depart in an hour. The snow has started earlier than expected, but Mr. Jenkins has lent us his strongest horse and a covered wagon. I've packed everything we own, which isn't much. Rebecca is fussy today, as if she senses my anxiety. I've tied my mother's locket around her neck, the one with her grandmother's picture inside. Somehow, it comforts her. If anything should happen to me on this journey, I pray that locket will help someone identify my child and return her to family." The next page held the final entry, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. "The storm has worsened. We've taken shelter in a cave by Pine Ridge, but the horse is spooked and keeps trying to bolt. I fear we've strayed from the path. The trees all look the same in the snow. Rebecca won't stop crying. I've never seen such a blizzard. If we don't reach the lumber camp by nightfall, I don't know what we'll do. I keep thinking I hear something moving outside the cave, something large. A bear, perhaps, though they should be hibernating by now. I'm so cold, so very cold." And there the journal ended. Sarah looked up at Thomas, her eyes shining with tears. She knew they were in danger. She was just trying to save her baby. Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze drawn to the golden locket on the mantel. If Eleanor's stories are true, if there's any possibility that somehow Lily's spirit stayed to protect her child, and other children, Sarah added softly. Eleanor said there were stories of lost children being guided to safety. And now Emma. Thomas finished the thought. Our Emma. They sat in silence for a long while, the fire crackling and popping in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the forest loomed dark and mysterious, harboring secrets that might never be fully understood. 3 days later, Thomas was opening the bakery when he noticed something odd on the doorstep. A small pile of wild blueberries, perfectly ripe despite being early in the season. Beside the berries lay a single black bear hare. He collected the berries carefully and brought them inside, showing them to Sarah. They didn't speak about it, but later that day they left a fresh honey cake at the edge of the forest, along with the day's unsold bread. As spring turned to summer, these strange exchanges continued. Small offerings left at the bakery door. Unusual feathers, particularly beautiful pine cones. Once even a rare wild orchid that Eleanor Blackwood later identified as extinct in this region for decades. Each time, Thomas and Sarah responded with gifts of their own. Baked goods, jars of preserves, once a small hand-knit blanket that Sarah had made. The townsfolk began to notice the bakery's special connection to the forest. Children whispered stories about the Holloways and their forest friends. Some parents dismissed these tales as fantasy, but others, particularly the oldest families in Maplewood, nodded knowingly and kept a respectful distance from the edge of the woods. Emma grew from a newborn to an infant, beginning to sit up and take notice of the world around her. She showed a particular fascination with the forest, often staring for long periods at the tree line visible from the bakery windows. And on quiet days when the wind was just right, Sarah sometimes thought she could hear a distant huffing sound, that same comforting noise the mother bear had made over Emma's crib on that stormy night. One afternoon, as summer reached its peak, Eleanor Blackwood made another rare visit to the bakery. This time, she wasn't alone. A middle-aged man accompanied her, his weathered face suggesting a life spent outdoors, his eyes the same piercing blue as Eleanor's. This is Dr. James Harmon. Eleanor introduced him. Lily's husband, Rebecca's father. He's been working with the Wildlife Research Center on the other side of the mountain for the past 40 years. Thomas nearly dropped the tray of scones he was carrying. James Harmon? But I thought that I died in that lumber camp. The man's voice was deep, with a hint of sadness. No, though there were days I wished I had, after learning what happened to Lily and our baby. I couldn't stay in Maplewood after that. Too many memories. I went to college on a veteran scholarship, studied wildlife biology, spent my life trying to understand the creatures of these forests. Sarah invited them to sit in the small apartment above the bakery, away from curious customers. Emma napped peacefully in her crib, the same portable crib that had been in the bakery that fateful night. Aunt Eleanor told me about what happened here, James said, declining the offered coffee, about the bear and my wife's locket. His eyes strayed to the wooden box on the mantel where they kept the precious object. Sarah retrieved the box and handed it to him. It belongs to your family, Dr. Harmon. We never meant to keep it from you. James opened the box with trembling hands, gazing at the locket for a long moment before closing the box again without touching its contents. Number, my aunt is right. It came to you for a reason. He handed the box back to Sarah. I've spent decades studying the black bears of these mountains. They've always been unusual, more intelligent than their counterparts in other regions, more human, some might say. Thomas leaned forward. Have you ever witnessed anything like what we experienced? A bear showing protective behavior toward humans? James nodded slowly. Several documented cases over the years. Most scientists attribute it to curiosity or unusual conditioning, but I've had my own theories. He paused, glancing at his aunt. Theories that would get me laughed out of academic circles. You believe the stories? Sarah asked quietly. About spirits taking animal form? I believe there are forces in nature we don't yet understand, James replied carefully. And I believe that the bond between mother and child is perhaps the strongest of these forces. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. I've brought something I think you should see. From the pouch, he produced a small, smooth stone, about the size of a robin's egg, with unusual markings etched into its surface. This was found in the cave where Lily and Rebecca took shelter during the blizzard. Search parties discovered it years later, along with remains. His voice caught slightly. Lily's remains, but never Rebecca's. Eleanor placed a comforting hand on her nephew's arm. James has spent his life searching for answers. And have you found them? Thomas asked. James turned the stone over in his palm. Not answers exactly, but connections. This stone bears markings that anthropologists identify as belonging to the indigenous people who lived in these mountains centuries ago. Their legends speak of guardian spirits that take animal form to protect the innocent, particularly children. A strange silence fell over the room, broken only by Emma's soft breathing from the nearby crib. Sarah found herself drawn to the window, staring out at the tree line where the forest began. There's something else, James continued, his voice lowering as if he feared being overheard. Something I've told no one, not even Aunt Eleanor. Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances, waiting as James seemed to gather his courage. 5 years after Lily and Rebecca disappeared, I was part of a research team tracking bear migrations in these mountains. We were deep in the forest, in an area locals call the Shadow Valley, a place so remote that even experienced hunters avoid it. James's hands tightened around the stone. That's where I saw her. Your wife? Sarah whispered. James shook his head. Number, my daughter. Rebecca, or what appeared to be my daughter. Eleanor gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. James, you never told me. Because it sounds insane, he said, a flash of pain crossing his weathered features. She would have been 6 years old then. And there she was, a little girl with Lily's blonde hair and my blue eyes, watching me from between the trees. She was wearing what looked like roughly made clothing, animal hides perhaps, and she wasn't alone. The bear, Thomas said, the words escaping him before he could stop them. James nodded slowly. A female black bear, larger than any I'd recorded in our studies. She stood behind Rebecca, not menacing, but protective, watchful. When I called out Rebecca's name, the girl smiled at me. I swear she recognized the name, but then the bear made a sound, and they both disappeared into the underbrush. I searched for hours, but it was as if they'd vanished into thin air. Did you report this? Sarah asked, unconsciously moving closer to Emma's crib. To whom? My scientific colleagues, who would have me committed? The authorities, who had long since closed the case. James shook his head bitterly. I kept returning to that valley whenever I could, hoping for another glimpse. 3 years later I saw her again, older, wilder, her movements more like those of the bear that still accompanied her. After that, nothing. For decades. Eleanor had gone very pale. You believe Rebecca survived the blizzard? That somehow this bear raised her? There are documented cases of feral children, James said quietly. Children raised by animals after being abandoned or lost. Most don't survive, and those who do are often irreparably damaged by the experience. But those are cases of neglect or abandonment. This was different. If the stories are true, if somehow Lily's spirit found a way to remain with our daughter. Sarah felt goosebumps rising on her arms. But Rebecca would be an adult now, in her 60s. James nodded. I've thought of that every day for the past 40 years. I've wondered if she remained in the forest her entire life, or if she returned to human society somewhere far from here, with no memory of her origins. I've wondered if she lived at all, or if what I saw was merely grief playing tricks on my mind. He sighed heavily. But then, Aunt Eleanor told me about what happened here, about the mother bear who protected your child, and Lily's locket that somehow found its way back after all these years. Thomas had been unusually quiet, processing this fantastical tale. Now he spoke, his voice tentative. Dr. Harmon, are you suggesting that the bear who came into our bakery might be connected to your daughter somehow? That doesn't seem possible. Black bears can live 30 years in the wild, sometimes longer in exceptional cases, James replied. The bear I saw with Rebecca would be long dead by now, but bears have territories that are passed down through generations. Cubs learn from their mothers what foods are safe, which areas to avoid, how to interact with other creatures. A sudden, startling thought occurred to Sarah. The cub, she said. The bear who came into our bakery had a cub with her. If Rebecca grew up in the forest, if she lived among the bears all these years, could the mother bear who protected your daughter be Rebecca's child or grandchild? James finished the thought, his eyes bright with a painful hope. Or, if not literally, then perhaps spiritually, another link in a chain of protection that started that winter night in 1959. It seemed too fantastic to believe. Yet Thomas found himself remembering the intelligence in the mother bear's eyes, the almost human care she had shown toward Emma. He thought of the small offerings that still occasionally appeared on their doorstep. The berries, feathers, and flowers that no ordinary bear would collect and deliver. As if sensing she was being discussed, Emma stirred in her crib, making soft babbling sounds. Sarah went to her, lifting the baby into her arms. Emma's eyes, still the deep blue of early infancy, seemed unusually alert as she looked from face to face, lingering longest on James. "May I?" the older man asked hesitantly, holding out his arms. With only slight reluctance, Sarah passed Emma to him. James cradled her carefully, studying her tiny features with an expression of mingled joy and sorrow. "She has Lily's chin," Eleanor observed softly. "The same little dimple." James nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Emma reached up with one tiny hand, patting his whiskered cheek with surprising gentleness for an infant. The gesture brought tears to the old man's eyes. "I've spent my life studying the creatures of these forests," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "Trying to understand them, protect them. If my Rebecca did survive, if she somehow found a way to live between the human and animal worlds, then perhaps there was purpose in my loss. Perhaps she became something extraordinary." As twilight deepened outside the windows, Emma began to fuss, ready for her evening feeding. Sarah took her back from James, settling into a rocking chair to nurse her. The conversation continued in hushed tones, circling around the impossible connections between past and present, human and animal, life and what might come after it. Finally, as night fully claimed the world outside, James and Eleanor prepared to leave. At the door, James turned back to Sarah and Thomas, his expression solemn. "I've avoided telling you something," he admitted. "The real reason I came here today." Thomas tensed slightly. "What is it?" "The Forest Service has approved a new logging operation," James said heavily. "In the Shadow Valley, the same area where I saw Rebecca all those years ago. It's set to begin next month." Sarah felt her heart sink. "But the bears will be displaced, yes, including the mother bear and cub who visited your bakery." James hesitated. "I've spent decades protecting those woods and the creatures in them, but I'm just one researcher and the demand for timber is high. The permits have been approved." "There must be something we can do," Thomas insisted, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. Just weeks ago he would have considered bears nothing more than wild animals, potentially dangerous ones at that. Now he felt personally invested in their survival. "Perhaps there is," James said carefully. "The logging company needs local support for the operation. They're hosting a town meeting next week to address concerns." He glanced at Eleanor. "My aunt and I will be there to present ecological arguments against the project, but a personal testimony from a respected local business owner who's had direct contact with these bears might carry significant weight." The request hung in the air between them. Speaking publicly would mean revealing their experience with the bear, opening themselves to skepticism and ridicule from neighbors who might not understand. It would mean sharing their private miracle with the world. "We'll think about it," Sarah said diplomatically, though Thomas could see in her eyes that she had already made her decision. After James and Eleanor left, the young couple sat in silence for a long while, each lost in their own thoughts. Emma dozed in Sarah's arms, peaceful and untroubled by the weight of the choices facing her parents. "Are we really considering this?" Thomas finally asked. "Standing up at a town meeting to defend bears? Based on a story no one would believe?" Sarah looked down at their sleeping daughter. "This bear protected our child, Thomas." She put herself between Emma and danger. "How can we do any less for her?" Thomas nodded slowly, knowing his wife was right, but still apprehensive about the path ahead. "What about James's story, about Rebecca growing up in the forest? Do you believe it?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "It seems impossible, but then so does a wild bear, tucking a baby's blanket around her and leaving bread in her crib. She stroked Emma's fine hair. Something extraordinary happened in our bakery that night. Whether it was Lily's spirit or Rebecca's influence through generations of bears, or simply a miracle of nature, does it really matter? The outcome is the same. Our daughter is safe because of that bear. Thomas moved to the window, gazing out at the darkened forest. Somewhere out there, the mother bear and her cub were foraging in the night, unaware of the threat to their home. Or perhaps they were aware. Perhaps they understood more than any human would credit. The boundaries between the possible and impossible had become blurred for Thomas since that stormy night. "We'll go to the meeting," he decided. "We'll tell our story, the parts of it that others might believe at least. We owe them that much." Sarah nodded, relief evident in her expression. "And the locket? What do we tell people about that?" Thomas considered the question. "Nothing for now. That's between us, Emma, and the Harmons. Some mysteries deserve to remain private." As they prepared for bed that night, a strange sound drew Thomas back to the window. A haunting, melodic howl rose from the forest edge, not a wolf, but something similar. It was answered by another call, deeper and more resonant, from further within the trees. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, joining him at the window with Emma cradled against her shoulder. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. I've never heard anything like it." The calls continued, a mournful duet that seemed to speak of longing and memory, of connections that stretched across time and the boundaries between species. As suddenly as they had begun, the sound ceased, leaving behind a silence that felt charged with meaning. That night, Thomas dreamed of a woman with wild blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, moving through the forest with the fluid grace of a bear. She didn't speak, but her message was clear. Protect them as they protected your child. In the morning, he remembered every detail of the dream with unusual clarity, further strengthening his resolve to attend the town meeting. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that their decision would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just their lives, but the entire town of Maplewood, and its relationship with the forest that had always been its shadow self. The week leading up to the town meeting passed in a blur of preparation. Thomas and Sarah reviewed the security footage countless times, selecting segments that showed the mother bear's protective behavior without revealing the more inexplicable moments that might strain credibility. They practiced their testimony, trying to present their experience in terms that would resonate with practical-minded townsfolk. Meanwhile, James Harmon had been busy rallying support among conservation groups and wildlife enthusiasts. Eleanor, respected if somewhat feared for her eccentric ways, spoke with the town elders, reminding them of old promises and older legends about the forest and its guardians. The night before the meeting, Thomas was closing up the bakery when he noticed something unusual on the doorstep, a perfect circle of pine cones, arranged with deliberate precision. In the center lay a small object that caught the fading sunlight. Bending down, he discovered a tiny carved wooden bear, so detailed it might have been created by a master artisan. He brought it inside to show Sarah, who turned it over in her palm with wonder. "This isn't from the mother bear," she said with certainty. "No animal, no matter how intelligent, could carve wood like this." They both thought of James's story, of a little girl growing up wild in the forest, of generations that might have followed her, living between worlds. Neither spoke the thought aloud, but they added the wooden bear to the collection of offerings in the special box they kept on the mantel. The town meeting was held in Maplewood's modest community center, a converted church with stained glass windows depicting the region's logging history. Nearly everyone in town had turned out, curious about the proposed operation that promised jobs, but threatened the ancient forest many considered part of their heritage. Representatives from Northwest Timber stood at the front, dressed in crisp suits that marked them as outsiders in this rural community. They had brought glossy brochures and a slick presentation about sustainable harvesting practices and minimal environmental impact. But their promises rang hollow against the backdrop of James Harmon's meticulous research, which he presented with the quiet authority of a man who had spent his life studying these woods. When it came time for community comment, Sarah stood first, Emma in her arms. The baby had been unusually quiet throughout the meeting, her wide eyes taking in the crowded room with remarkable focus for an infant. "Most of you know us," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "My husband Thomas and I own Sweetleaf Bakery at the edge of town. What you don't know is what happened there 3 weeks ago during that big storm." A hush fell over the room as Sarah recounted their experience. The mother bear entering the bakery, the protective behavior toward Emma, the confrontation with the stray dog. She carefully omitted the more fantastical elements: the locket, the bear cub climbing into the crib, the strange communion between species that had moved her to tears when she watched the security footage. "I was terrified when I first saw this wild animal near my baby," she admitted. "But what I witnessed wasn't aggression or danger. It was protection. This bear put herself between my child and harm." She looked directly at the timber company representatives. "Now, it's our turn to protect her and her family." Thomas joined his wife, bringing with him a tablet that displayed selected clips from their security footage. A murmur ran through the crowd as they watched the grainy black and white video showing the massive bear standing guard over the baby's crib, warding off the aggressive dog. "I've lived in Maplewood all my life," Thomas said when the video ended. "I've always considered bears to be dangerous wildlife that we should keep at a distance. But that night changed everything for me." He gestured toward the timber company representatives. "You see natural resources when you look at our forests, but those woods are home to creatures with intelligence and compassion that we barely understand." Several hands shot up around the room. The town moderator, Mayor Jenkins, recognized Mrs. Peterson, who owned the local hardware store. "How do we know the bear wasn't just going after the dog to defend its own cub?" she asked skeptically. "Or that it wasn't searching for food and happened to be there when the dog came in?" Before Thomas could respond, Eleanor Blackwood rose from her seat in the back row. Heads turned to watch the elderly woman make her slow way to the front. "I've lived alongside these woods for 87 years, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "And in all that time, I've collected stories. Stories most of you have heard me tell but dismissed as an old woman's imagination." She turned to face the crowd rather than the timber representatives. Stories of children found safely when they should have been lost forever. Hikers guided back to trails by a large shadow moving just ahead of them in a snowstorm. A trapper whose leg was crushed under a fallen tree, who swears he was kept warm through the night by a bear that brought him berries and fresh water before help arrived. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Most had indeed heard Eleanor's tales, usually shared around campfires or at the annual Harvest Festival, when the veil between reality and folklore seemed thinnest. James Harmon stepped forward now, adding his scientific credibility to the emotional appeals. "The black bears of Shadow Valley exhibit behaviors that are unique among their species. Their social structures, their problem-solving abilities, their interactions with humans, all suggest an unusual adaptation to this specific environment." He directed his comments to the timber representatives. "Your environmental impact report doesn't account for the displacement of these particular bears because your researchers haven't spent enough time observing them to understand their significance." One of the timber executives, a sharp-featured woman named Ms. Chambers, stepped forward with a tight smile. While these stories are certainly colorful, Northwest Timber has all the necessary permits and authorizations. The logging operation will proceed as scheduled, with all standard wildlife protection protocols in place. "What about non-standard wildlife?" came a voice from the middle of the room. It was Dr. Martinez, who ran the local veterinary clinic. "I treated a fawn last winter that was brought to my door in the middle of the night. No person in sight, just the fawn with a crude splint on its broken leg made of twigs and what looked like woven grass. I assumed some hiker had found it and was too shy to stick around for questions." He paused, looking troubled. "But maybe I was wrong about who helped that fawn before bringing it to me." More voices joined in, sharing stories that had seemed too strange to speak of before. Encounters at the forest edge that defied simple explanation. Acts of apparent intelligence from the local wildlife that went beyond instinct. As the discussion intensified, the back door of the community center creaked open. A gust of cool evening air swept through the room, carrying with it an earthy scent of moss and pine. Every head turned toward the unexpected interruption. A woman stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkening sky outside. She was tall and lean, dressed in rough, handmade clothing that hung awkwardly on her frame. Her hair was a wild tangle of gray blonde, falling past her shoulders in uncombed waves. Her face, when she stepped into the light, was weathered beyond her apparent years, lined by decades of exposure to the elements. But it was her eyes that silenced the room. Piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold both wildness and profound intelligence, taking in the gathering with an expression that was neither fully human nor entirely animal. James Harmon let out a choked sound, half gasp and half sob. Eleanor Blackwood gripped the back of a chair for support, her face draining of color. The strange woman made no move to speak. She simply stood, watching, her head tilted slightly in a gesture that eerily mimicked the posture of the bear in the security footage. Her gaze moved slowly around the room, pausing on Sarah and Emma, lingering on James, and finally settling on the timber company representatives. Ms. Chambers recovered first, her corporate training overcoming her shock at the interruption. "Ma'am, this is a closed town meeting. If you're not a resident, she belongs here." Eleanor cut in, her voice quavering with emotion. "She belongs here more than any of us." The strange woman still didn't speak. Instead, she reached into a rough pouch at her waist and withdrew an object that caught the fluorescent lights of the community center. It was another carved wooden bear, identical to the one Thomas had found on the bakery doorstep. With deliberate movements, she placed it on the table in front of the timber representatives, then turned and walked out the way she had come, disappearing into the gathering darkness. For several heartbeats, no one moved or spoke. Then James Harmon rushed toward the door, Eleanor close behind him despite her age. Thomas and Sarah exchanged a glance loaded with unspoken understanding before following, Emma still cradled in Sarah's arms. Outside, the night air was thick with the promise of rain. The strange woman was already at the edge of the parking lot, moving with unusual speed and grace toward the tree line. James called out, a wordless cry that seemed torn from the depths of his being. The woman paused, looking back over her shoulder. For a moment, she seemed to hesitate, her expression softening into something almost recognizable as longing. Then a sound came from the forest. Not quite a growl, not quite a call, but something between the two. The woman's head turned sharply toward it, her posture immediately alert. Without another glance at the humans watching her, she melted into the shadows beneath the trees and was gone. James made to follow her, but Eleanor caught his arm, holding him back with surprising strength. "Not now," she said softly. "Not like this, with so many watching." The timber representatives had emerged from the community center as well, along with most of the town. All stood transfixed, staring at the spot where the woman had vanished as if they expected her to reappear. Ms. Chambers was the first to break the spell, her voice noticeably less confident than before. "Who was that?" "Some environmental activist you brought in to disrupt the meeting." No one answered her directly. Instead, Mayor Jenkins retrieved the carved wooden bear from inside and held it up for all to see. "I think," he said slowly, "that we need to reconsider this logging proposal. Thoroughly." The meeting ultimately adjourned without a resolution, but the tide of opinion had clearly turned. Even those who had initially supported the jobs the logging operation would bring seemed shaken by what they had witnessed. Not just the security footage or the strange woman's appearance, but the collective weight of stories that had emerged, tales long kept private for fear of ridicule. As the crowd dispersed into the night, Thomas and Sarah found themselves walking beside James and Eleanor, all four silent with the enormity of what had just occurred. "Was that?" Thomas finally asked, unable to complete the question. James shook his head, his expression a mixture of grief and wonder. "I don't know. She had Lily's hair, my eyes. She'd be in her 60s now, but living in the wild, it's impossible to say for certain." "She didn't speak," Sarah observed quietly. "Could she not, or did she choose not to?" "Perhaps words aren't necessary when you've lived so long without them," Eleanor suggested. "Or perhaps she's forgotten our language, or never fully learned it to begin with." They had reached the edge of town, where the Holloways would turn toward the bakery, and James and Eleanor would continue on to their respective homes. In the distance, thunder rumbled, promising the storm that had been building all evening. "Will you try to find her?" Sarah asked, looking at James. The older man gazed toward the forest, now just a deeper darkness against the night sky. "I've been trying to find her for 60 years, he said softly. "But now I think she's found us." As they parted ways, Emma suddenly became animated in Sarah's arms, pointing insistently toward the trees and making an unusual sound. Not her typical babble, but something almost like the huffing noise the mother bear had made in the bakery. All four adults froze, staring at the baby in astonishment. Then, from the edge of the forest came an answering sound. That same huffing, followed by a deeper rumble that could only have come from a bear. "She's communicating with them," Eleanor whispered, her eyes wide. "The child is communicating with them." Sarah clutched Emma closer, not in fear, but in wonder. "What does this mean?" No one had an answer, but as they stood there in the gathering storm, the first heavy raindrops beginning to fall, they all sensed that something profound had changed. Not just for their small group, or even for the town, but for the ancient, complicated relationship between humans and the wild creatures with whom they shared the world. 4 days after the town meeting, Northwest Timber announced they were indefinitely postponing the logging operation in Shadow Valley, citing unexpected cultural and environmental factors requiring further assessment. The company representatives left Maplewood without further explanation, though rumors circulated that Miss Chambers had experienced an unnerving encounter while taking a solitary walk near the forest the night after the meeting. Whatever she had seen or heard had apparently been convincing enough to abandon a potentially lucrative project. For the Holloways, life gradually settled into a new normal, one that acknowledged and embraced the strange connection they now shared with the forest and its inhabitants. They continued to leave bread and honey cakes at the tree line, and occasionally found small treasures in return. Unusual stones, rare flowers that bloomed only in the deepest parts of the woods, once even a perfect bird's nest, abandoned after its fledglings had flown. Emma grew with remarkable speed, as babies do. By her first birthday, she was walking and beginning to form words. Some were the usual mama and dada, but others were unusual sounds that made Sarah and Thomas exchange worried glances, guttural noises that seemed to mimic animal calls rather than human speech. Dr. Patterson, the local pediatrician, assured them that many children developed idiosyncratic language patterns before fully mastering conventional speech. But he couldn't explain why wild birds would sometimes land on the bakery windowsill, cocking their heads as if listening when Emma made these sounds. James Harmon became a regular visitor to the bakery, often bringing research materials and field notes to share with Thomas and Sarah. He never spoke of the strange woman from the town meeting, though sometimes his eyes would drift to the forest edge with unmistakable longing. Whatever closure he might have hoped for seemed to elude him still. Eleanor taught Sarah to identify edible plants and mushrooms from the forest, traditional remedies that had been passed down through generations of mountain women. She spoke more freely now about Lily and baby Rebecca, sharing memories and stories that brought the long-lost mother and child vividly to life. The wooden box on the Holloway's mantel grew fuller with treasures, both those left by the bears and those given by Eleanor and James, fragments of a family history that somehow seemed entwined with their own. Autumn came to the mountains in a blaze of color, the forest transforming into a tapestry of crimson, gold, and bronze. The tourists who visited Maplewood for the fall foliage remarked on the unusual number of black bears seen near the hiking trails, not aggressive or threatening, just unusually visible, as if they had grown more comfortable with human presence. Thomas and Sarah said nothing about this change, but they noticed that these bears often seemed to be watching, evaluating, their intelligent eyes following human movements with disconcerting awareness. It was in late October, as the last leaves clung stubbornly to the branches and the first frost silvered the morning grass, that Emma spoke her first complete sentence. She was sitting in her high chair, watching the forest through the bakery window as Sarah prepared the morning's first batch of bread. "Bear come today," she said clearly, her small finger pointing toward the trees. Sarah nearly dropped the dough she was kneading. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Emma's eyes, which had gradually shifted from newborn blue to a striking hazel with flecks of gold, remained fixed on the forest. "Bear come today," she repeated with the same certainty. "Bring special." Thomas emerged from the storage room in time to hear his daughter's proclamation. He and Sarah exchanged worried glances. Emma had shown an uncanny awareness of the forest creatures since early infancy, often seeming to know when offerings would appear on their doorstep. But this was the first time she had so clearly predicted a visit. "Should we call James?" Thomas asked quietly. Sarah hesitated. The wildlife biologist had grown increasingly obsessed with documenting the unusual bear behaviors around Maplewood, spending long hours in observation blinds at the forest edge. His scientific mind battled constantly with his personal hope that somehow, impossibly, his long-lost daughter had survived and was connected to these bears. Perhaps even was the strange woman who had appeared so briefly at the town meeting. "Let's wait," Sarah decided. "See if she's right first." The morning passed uneventfully, with a steady stream of customers coming for bread and pastries. Emma remained unusually focused on the forest view, ignoring her toys and books. By closing time, Sarah had almost forgotten her daughter's strange prediction when the bell above the door chimed one last time. Eleanor Blackwood entered, looking more agitated than they had ever seen her. "Have you been to the forest edge today?" she asked without preamble. Thomas shook his head. "We've been busy with the bakery. Why?" The elderly woman pulled off her gloves with shaking hands. There's something there, something left for you, I think. I saw it on my walk, but I didn't touch it. It didn't seem right for me to interfere." Thomas immediately began closing up shop, while Sarah bundled Emma into her coat. The October afternoon was waning, shadows growing long as they followed Eleanor down the path that led from the bakery to the tree line. Emma grew increasingly animated in Sarah's arms, pointing and making those strange huffing sounds that still occasionally escaped her. At the precise spot where they usually left their offerings, a collection of objects had been arranged in a perfect circle. Pine cones, unusual stones, feathers, and dried flowers creating an intricate pattern that was clearly deliberate rather than accidental. In the center lay something that made Sarah gasp. It was a doll, crude but recognizable, crafted from what appeared to be woven grasses, twigs, bark, and animal fur. Its face was composed of small seeds for eyes, a carved piece of wood for a nose, and berries crushed to stain a smiling mouth. Around its neck hung a tiny replica of Lily's locket, fashioned from polished stone, and what might have been strands of copper wire from an abandoned human object. "Emma," the doll seemed to say, though it was only the wind sighing through the trees. Eleanor's weathered hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my," she whispered, "it's a gift for the child." Emma squirmed in Sarah's arms, reaching for the doll with surprising determination. Sarah hesitated, looking to Thomas for guidance. "Someone made this," he said quietly. "Someone with hands and human intelligence." He glanced nervously at the darkening forest. Eleanor nodded slowly. "Yes, I believe they did." "They?" Sarah asked, still holding Emma back from the strange offering. "Rebecca," Eleanor said simply, "and whoever else might be out there with her. Others who have found their way to the shadows between human and wild." The implications were staggering. Not just one person living secretly in these woods, but perhaps a small community. Humans who had adapted to life alongside the bears, or who were in some inexplicable way connected to them. Thomas thought of the carved wooden bears, the woven grass splint on the injured fawn Dr. Martinez had treated, the stories of lost hikers guided to safety. While they hesitated, Emma took matters into her own small hands. With a strength and coordination surprising in a 1-year-old, she lunged forward, nearly tumbling from Sarah's grasp. Her mother instinctively set her down rather than risk dropping her, and Emma immediately toddled to the circle of offerings, dropping to her knees beside the doll. "Emma, don't," Thomas began, moving forward to intercept her. But before he could reach her, movement at the forest edge froze him in place. A large black shape emerged partially from the shadows. The mother bear, instantly recognizable from the security footage. She watched calmly as Emma picked up the doll, examining it with delight. The bear made no move to approach further, simply observing with those intelligent eyes that had haunted Thomas's dreams for months. Behind her, barely visible in the deepening twilight, stood another figure. Taller, upright, human in shape if not entirely in movement. The strange woman from the town meeting, or someone like her. Emma looked up from her doll, directly at the bear and the shadowy human figure. With perfect clarity, she made that distinctive huffing sound they had heard from the mother bear, not an imitation now, but a communication. Then, to her parents' astonishment, she spoke again. "Thank you," she said, her small voice carrying in the still evening air. She held up the doll as if to show her appreciation, then hugged it close. The bear responded with a soft huff of her own. The human figure behind her moved slightly, one arm raising in what might have been a gesture of acknowledgement. Then both retreated into the gathering darkness of the forest, disappearing as silently as they had come. For a long moment no one moved or spoke. Emma continued examining her doll, seemingly untroubled by the extraordinary encounter. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "She understands them," she said softly, "and they understand her." Thomas found his voice at last. "How is this possible?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. "When my sister Lily disappeared with baby Rebecca, I mourned them both as dead. For years, I believed that. But my grandmother used to tell stories. Old stories from before the settlers came to these mountains. Stories about the boundary between the human world and the wild one being thinner in certain places at certain times.